خلافت کے بنا اپنا نہیں کچھ بھی گزارا ہے، یہی ظلمات بحر و بر میں ایک اپنا سہارا ہے۔ خلافت کے بنا اپنا نہیں کچھ بھی گزارا ہے۔
Another very moving incident and how Huzoor's prayers were answered. It's also from Australia. It's in 2013. I met a young family, a husband and wife, and they told me their story. They said they had been blessed with a child 2 years before, but unfortunately ever since the child had been born, he'd been unable to take any milk whatsoever, and any form of dairy product or any milk, and he would throw it up. He was lactose intolerant very, very severely. And the mother, she was very worried. She was a doctor herself, but she said that I've tried every single type of remedy. Nothing is working. I've taken him to doctor after doctor, and they don't know what the issue is. And I'm just worried, I've been worried, how is my child going to grow? She said during that tour, just the day before, she had the first opportunity of her life to meet Huzoor. And so she went and she took some honey, and she said, the first thing I said to Huzoor when I entered was, Huzoor, please, can you feed my child some of this honey, because he's unable to take milk. Huzoor took some of the honey and placed it in the child's mouth, who was then 2 years old. She told me that night they went home, they fed the child milk, and he completely digested it without any problem whatsoever. The next morning they did the same. He was completely fine. And then ever since, for the rest of the tour, I kept asking them. They said there's no problem. Even the doctors are surprised. I spoke to the same individual just 2 days ago, and he said since that day our child is growing perfectly. He has never had any single issue in his life. Alhamdulillah.
جرمنی سے ایک اور دوست ہیں، سنوری صاحب ہیں، انہوں نے یہ واقعہ بھی بتایا کہ 2010 میں میری طبیعت خراب ہوئی تو میں ہاسپٹل میں داخل ہوا۔ چیک اپ کے بعد پتہ چلا کہ پھیپھڑوں میں پانی آ گیا، اور پانی آنے کی وجہ معلوم کرنے کے لیے مختلف ٹیسٹ کیے گئے، جن سے یہ پتہ چلا کہ دل کا والو بھی خراب ہے اور اس کی وجہ سے پھیپھڑوں میں پانی آیا، اور والو کے اوپر کچھ جراثیم بھی ہیں جن کا فوری علاج ضروری تھا۔ تو کہتے ہیں مجھے ایمرجنسی میں رکھا گیا اس امید پر کہ دوائیاں وغیرہ دیں گے اور جراثیم خود ہی ختم ہو جائیں گے، لیکن ایسا نہ ہوا، اور دل جو تھا وہ کمزور سے کمزور ہوتا چلا گیا۔ آخر ڈاکٹروں نے آپریشن کا فیصلہ کیا، تو مجھے آپریشن کے لیے آپریشن تھیٹر لے جایا گیا۔ تقریباً 5 گھنٹے کے آپریشن کے بعد جب مجھے ہوش آئی تو مجھے بتایا گیا کہ آپریشن کامیاب ہو گیا۔ آپریشن کے چند دن بعد وارڈ میں وہ ڈاکٹر جنہوں نے میرا آپریشن کیا تھا وہ مجھے ملنے آئے۔ اس وقت وارڈ میں کہتے ہیں میرے علاوہ 3 جرمن مریض اور بھی تھے۔ ڈاکٹر نے خاکسار سے ایک عجیب و غریب سوال کیا۔ اس نے مجھے پوچھا کہ آپ کون ہیں؟ میں نے اپنا نام بتا دیا۔ ڈاکٹر کہتا ہے نام تو مجھے پہلے ہی پتا ہے۔ تو اس کے بعد ڈاکٹر نے خاکسار کو ایک بات بتائی جسے سن کر میری آنکھوں سے آنسو نکل آئے۔ اب وہ ڈاکٹر کی زبانی وہ بات بیان کرتے ہیں، کہتے ہیں ڈاکٹر کی زبانی وہ بات یوں تھی کہ آپریشن والے دن ان کی طبیعت ٹھیک نہیں تھی۔ خاکسار کو بے ہوش کر کے آپریشن تھیٹر میں لے جایا جا چکا تھا۔ طبیعت ٹھیک، یعنی ڈاکٹر کی طبیعت بھی ٹھیک نہیں تھی، ان کی تو تھی نہیں، ان کی تو یہ تو بیمار تھے، ان کا تو آپریشن ہونا ہی تھا، لیکن ڈاکٹر کی طبیعت خود اپنی ٹھیک نہیں تھی، اور وہ چاہتا تھا کہ میں آج آپریشن نہ کروں، لیکن ان کو آپریشن تھیٹر میں لے جایا جا چکا تھا، اور ڈاکٹر کی طبیعت ٹھیک نہ ہونے کی وجہ سے ڈاکٹر کو گھبراہٹ اور پریشانی بھی تھی، لیکن اس نے آپریشن کرنا بھی اس کے لیے ضروری تھا۔ تو ڈاکٹر نے بتایا کہ کوشش کے باوجود ان کے لیے آپریشن کرنا ممکن نہیں ہو رہا تھا۔ تو اس نے سوچا کہ میں کچھ تازہ ہوا لینے کے لیے اور طبیعت کو سنبھالا دینے کے لیے اور بہتر کرنے کے لیے میں کچھ دیر باہر جا کے کھلی ہوا میں بیٹھتا ہوں۔ تو کہتے ہیں میں باہر گھاس پہ آ کے بیٹھ گیا۔ اس دوران انہوں نے دیکھا کہ ایک آدمی ان کے پاس آ کر ان کے ڈاکٹر کے پاس آیا اور ڈاکٹر کے کندھوں کو تھپ تھپایا اور کہا کہ پریشان نہ ہو، سب ٹھیک ہو جائے گا، اس کو کچھ نہیں ہوگا۔ تو ڈاکٹر نے دوبارہ اس کی طرف دیکھا تو وہ وہاں پہ کوئی نہیں تھا، کوئی موجود نہیں تھا۔ یہ پیغام دے کے تھپ تھپا کے اس کے कंधों को, और ये बात कह के तो वो चला गया। डॉक्टर को वो आदमी नज़र नहीं आया बात करने वाला। तो बहरहाल डॉक्टर बहुत हैरान हुआ कि वो आदमी कहाँ चला गया है। कहते हैं कि इसके बाद डॉक्टर जो था वो ऑपरेशन थिएटर में आया, बगैर किसी परेशानी के उसने मेरा ऑपरेशन किया, जो अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह कामयाब रहा। खाकसार ने उससे पूछा कि क्या नज़र आने वाले शख्स की दाढ़ी भी थी? अब ये हमारा खादम जो है वो डॉक्टर से सवाल कर रहा है कि नज़र आने वाला जो शख्स था क्या उसकी कोई दाढ़ी भी थी? तो डॉक्टर ने जवाब दिया कि हाँ। फिर डॉक्टर ये बात बता रहे थे और मेरी आंखों से फिर आंसू रवां हो गए। ये सारी बात कमरे में मौजूद बाकी दोस्त भी सुन रहे थे। तो खाकसार ने अपने मोबाइल पे हुजूर की तस्वीर जो थी वो निकाली और डॉक्टर को दिखाई। तो डॉक्टर ने पूछा कि ये तस्वीर मेरे पास कहाँ से आई है, क्योंकि ये तो वही शख्स है जिसने मुझे आके तसल्ली दी थी और कहा था कि जाओ जाके ऑपरेशन करो, कुछ नहीं होगा। तो डॉक्टर ने कहा कि मैं इसी वजह से तुमसे पूछ रहा था कि तुम कौन हो, कौन तुम, क्योंकि आज मेरी जिंदगी में ऐसा वाकया कभी नहीं हुआ। डॉक्टर के साथ कमरे में मौजूद बाकी लोग भी हैरान थे। डॉक्टर ने पूछा कि ये कौन है जिनको आपकी इतनी फिक्र थी? तो ये कहते हैं कि मैंने डॉक्टर को बताया कि हमारा तो ईमान है, ये हमारे खलीफतुल मसीह थे, और हमारा ईमान है कि जब हम इनको दुआ के लिए खत लिख देते हैं तो फिर अल्लाह ताला सब कुछ संवार देता है, और ये हमारे आका की दुआएं हमारे साथ होती हैं, और जब वो साथ हों तो फिर कैसे मुमकिन था कि वो मुझे अकेला छोड़ देता। खाकसार 2 महीने अस्पताल में रहने के बाद खैर वफियत के साथ सेहत याब होकर घर आ गया।
कोई ऐसा भी है जो दूसरों के दर्द में जागे, यकीनन एक बंदा है खलीफा वो हमारा है, यकीनन एक बंदा है खलीफा वो हमारा है।
Hazur just came back a few weeks ago, as all of you know, from America and Guatemala, from the United States and Guatemala. And it was an extremely, extremely hectic and busy tour. The first 2 weeks were non-stop travel and non-stop work, especially. Hazur arrived on Monday at the mosque after a long flight from here, about 11 p.m. Finally, he arrived at Bet Rahman their time, which was about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning UK time. The next morning, he was doing an inspection of the mosque. The next afternoon, he was meeting MDs in mulaqats. The morning after that, Hazur travelled to a different city, Philadelphia, where he spent 2 or 3 days and opened the mosque and had a reception and met many MDs. The next day, Hazur went to Baltimore, another city, opened a mosque there. The same evening, Hazur went back to Washington. The next morning, Hazur, very, very early in the morning, left Washington and flew to Houston, and which was an all-day, took all day, and then in the evening, again, work. The next morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, Hazur left his residence, flew to Guatemala. In Guatemala, Hazur was there for less than 48 hours, opened the hospital, met so many MDs, flew back to Houston, spent a couple of days there, and then flew back to Washington. It was only when we got back to Washington that we had 4 or 5 days at the end, or 5 or 6 days, where there was less travel. Now, just the travel schedule was more than enough to make most of us completely exhausted. But wherever Hazur went, straight away his meetings would start, whether it was with politicians, external people, whether it was meeting MDs in mulaqats, whether it was opening mosques or hospitals. It was completely exhausting just to watch. Before Hazur went to America, the American Jamaat proposed that when Hazur goes to Guatemala, it's the first time he's going there. There is a very, very beautiful lake, which is a couple of hours away from the mosque. So Hazur, 2 days would be of work, but they thought that for 2 days or 1 night, but 2 full days, Hazur could go and visit this lake, which is very, very historic and one of the wonders of the world. When the program came to Hazur, the first thing he went through it, and he crossed that 2 days out, He said, if I go there for 2 days, then that's 2 days less meeting the MDs and doing my Jamaat duties. Now again, that's the spirit with which Khalifa Waqt is working, that he is sacrificing the type of pleasures that all of us humans, we would like at some point in our lives. If you go all the way to Central America, but you don't see a thing and the only thing you see is the mosque or the hospital you're opening, some people, normal people, you would feel some sense of regret. But that's his own choice, because his duty and his desire is only to please Allah, and for that he's willing to sacrifice every single personal need. Then when Hazur returned from that tour, we got back to Masjid Fazl about 12:30. Myself, it was an overnight flight, I was extremely tired, I went home, the rest of the Qafla members all went home. 12:30, 1 o'clock, Hazur was in the mosque to lead namaz. Then later on, Hazur told me, he said after namaz, he went up, he had lunch, he rested for about half an hour, 45 minutes. And then Hazur came to his office around 3 o'clock. And Hazur said that from then on, almost non-stop, he sat in his office till midnight. I think the only time he took for break was for namaz and a short break for his evening meal. And he was just going through the files that had built up in his absence. The next day again, Hazur was back in the office, serving just the same, whilst the rest of us recovered from the arduous tour.
बराहे रास्त उसका है ताल्लुक अर्श वाले से, जो उसकी मर्जी होती है वही इसका इशारा है.
I remember in Australia, when Hazur visited in 2013, it was quite a long tour. Hazur was there for a month. And the second part of the tour, Hazur was going to the city of Melbourne. And so Hazur went to the airport at Sydney, from where he was going to take his flight to Melbourne. As Hazur entered the airport in his car, there was a barrier which you see often in car parks, which is raised when a car enters and then the car crosses. However, it so happened that as Hazur entered the car park, the barrier came crashing down and hit the top of Hazur's car with quite a lot of force. I remember all of us, I was in the car behind, and quite others, we were very panicked. We were wondering if Hazur and Hazrat Begum Sahiba were okay. And so we rushed out, and I saw Hazur come out of the car, and Hazur looked around and he inspected the car, but thankfully Hazur and Hazrat Begum Sahiba were both fine. Anyway, a couple of weeks later, I was speaking to the Naib Sadr, one of the Naib Sadrs in Australia, and I hadn't seen him for a while. And so I said, where have you been for the last couple of weeks? I saw you in the first part of the tour, but I never saw you for the last 2 weeks. He told me, he said that day when Hazur was at the airport, I was the one who called Hazur's car through because I was on duty. And then the barrier came down, so I had called Hazur's car at the wrong moment. He said, I felt completely ashamed. He said that I felt my whole world has collapsed. And for the next 2 weeks, I put myself on parking duty far, far away from Hazur's residence, because I couldn't bear to be close to him, knowing that I had made this grave error. But he said today, Sadr Sahib had instructed that he goes back to Hazur's residence. When he went back to Hazur's residence, he told me that morning that as soon as Hazur came out, Hazur saw him, Hazur smiled at him, and Hazur said, where have you been for the past week, 10 days? And he said that at that moment I could not control my emotions, to know that despite my error, and despite the fact Hazur is so busy, he had noticed that I had not been there. Similarly, I'll give you one more incident, a similar incident. It's from 2012 in Canada. Hazur had attended the Jalsa Salana in 2012, and there had been a number of weaknesses during the Jalsa, some problems with sound and some other issues. I remember that on the final Friday sermon, Hazur spoke very clearly in his khutbah that he had not been happy with some of the arrangements. And he admonished the local Jamaat to improve in future quite seriously and quite severely. There were people who I was seated next to, where I could see as the khutbah was being delivered that they had tears in their eyes, and later in the namaz I could hear their tears actually, and them physically shaking, having received this admonishment. Throughout the day, I remember even the Peace Village is filled with thousands of Ahmadis. There was a sense of sadness in the city, in the town. I remember Sadr Sahib was there as well, and I remember actually even talking to Sadr Sahib about it. Anyway, that evening at 11 p.m, after Hazur's activities had concluded, and Hazur had gone back to the residence, and we thought we were done for the day, I was somewhere in Peace Village, not far from the residence, and I suddenly heard the loudest nare possible. And so I ran to see what was happening, and I saw that Hazur had come out of his house. And Hazur had just started impromptu walking along the streets. And as word of the fact that Hazur was on the streets came out, people came rushing out of their houses, and all in that area is all Ahmadis who live. And so literally over the next 20-25 minutes, thousands of people were on the streets, rushing, and you could see tears coming out of their eyes. You could see the happiness on their face. Hazur was waving to them, smiling at them. You could see that the pain of the entire day had wiped away in those few minutes. And in my mind, I thought to myself that the reason Hazur has chosen this day is because he knows that today the Jamaat was suffering. Today the Jamaat was feeling sadness in their hearts. Hazur also on tours I've seen cares not only for the people around him, his Kafla members or the local Jamaat, but he also looks out for the people who are left behind. On many occasions I've seen, this is just my incident, I'm sure it's with all the other members, that Hazur asks me on tours how my family are doing. I remember last year in Germany, in one day in particular, Hazur said to me that I should send a text message to my wife. And he said, you should write, I miss you. And Hazur probably knows that I'm not very emotional in these things, and so even to write I miss you was difficult for me. But anyway, Hazur said it, so I wrote a text message back to my wife saying I miss you. Within a minute I got a response saying we miss you too, and there was like a smiley, and so she was very, very happy and delighted. But then another minute later she sent another text message. She said, did Hazur tell you to send that message? But the thing is that that's the beauty of Khilafat. When she found out that the message had been on the advice of Hazur, she felt even more happiness than any message I could ever have sent her.
खिलाफत के बिना अपना नहीं कुछ भी गुजारा है, यही जुल्मात बहरोबर में एक अपना सहारा है।